and welcome. Today, I'm finishing the series that I've been working on for the last half a year, where I've been covering all of the Fromsoft soulsborn games. If you're unfamiliar with the series, I 100% the game and then I talk about my experiences with that here on this channel. Today, we're gonna be covering Elden Ring and its expansion Shadow of the Erdtree. Elden Ring is really unique to me because it was the first FromSoft Soulsborn game that I played and ended up really falling in love with. The combat clicked for me, the movement clicked for me, the story clicked for me, everything just fell into place. And while my first playthrough wasn't one of the ones you can call skillful or in any way good, I used summons and mainly sat on mana and other players to carry me through difficult fights. My spell usage was literally off the charts. I was on that Combat Assert grind set, and as you all know if you played in the older patches, Combat Assert was quite busted back in the day. But I'm back after multiple other FromSoft Soulsborn games to play it again. And I can quite say it's still my favorite. Other than Sekiro, Elden Ring is still my favorite game from FromSoft ever. Elden Ring is possibly one of the best games ever made, if not the best game ever made. And let's just talk a bit about why. One of the most unique aspects of Elden Ring in comparison to the other FromSoft games has to be its open world. The open world brings many things to the table. It is both one of the reasons why Elden Ring is one of the easier games, and it's also one of the reasons why Elden Ring is just so damn good. Because on your first playthrough, that open world will be unlike anything you have ever seen. The way FromSoft does this open world thing is just incredible. There aren't any direct guidance like there would be in a game like Far Cry. There aren't like any markers, anything like that. You have some markers you set yourself, but like there aren't any quest markers. And that's an approach I really like. Ghost of Tsushima did it, Elden Ring did it, and I love it. I really like that approach. There are some guidance towards your objectives. In Elden Ring, it is the way that the Site of Grace points. Otherwise, you'll usually just find out where to go through exploration. Because quite frankly, Elden Ring has a world that is worth exploring. And while I found that on my first playthrough ever, I remember that, I would get lost and then I'd end up in some random place like Rare Lucaria or Stormvale or Castle Morn, or just any place that really looks interesting. There are also guidance tips throughout the game, such as when you talk to White Mask Rara, he'll mention, oh, you should go over that Stormvale castle, that castle up on that hill, that's a really nice place to go, you should go there, please go there. There are hints throughout the game, right? And these hints sort of guide you towards where you need to go, and it's all well and good. However, one thing that Elden Ring does especially well is its side dungeons. On the first playthrough especially so. They fall off in later playthroughs mainly because the loot stays the same. So you finish the side dungeon and a unique piece of armor, a unique piece of gear, a unique weapon. And these can be accessed at basically any point in the game. There are areas where you need to have completed certain objectives to get to. But in general, if you have access to the area overall, like Limgrave, then you can access all dungeons within that area. And I found that to be a really interesting approach. Not least of which because it allows you to go to, let's say, a really high-end area where there might be some really good loot and just pick it up if there isn't a boss there to protect that. And it's also one of the reasons why Elden Ring ends up being incredibly accessible, because you can basically at any point in the game get a really good set of gear together. You can get a really good weapon together and just go around and wreck bosses. It is not a particularly hard game, and especially not if you use YouTube guides and whatnot, right? Then you can look up some builds and some guides for that. There's also a little giant sleeping dragon you can go ahead a couple of times that will speed level you to infinity at the early game. There are a bunch of things that essentially make Elden Ring a lot easier to get into, which is overall a positive thing, because it allows a lot of new people, myself included, to get into the game and then look retrospectively back on the others. And a lot of us ended up playing the other games, like Dark Souls or Dark Souls 3, for instance. And those games are not like that at all. They have a much more steep learning curve where you'll get your ass kicked for a while before you then find the gear to then do well. And that is a interesting approach that I've seen sparking some controversy back when the game came out. Some people, from what I could read myself too, didn't like the idea of it being so easy to get into, and the fact that it was so easy, because if you knew what to do, Elden Ring, especially in the earlier levels, weren't that hard. and it wasn't for me either. Then again, I did play sorceries, so obviously I had a pretty different experience because sorceries in Elden Ring are absolutely busted. There are some of the most insane spells I've ever seen. I've mentioned Combat Assert, essentially a Kamehameha beam you can shoot out that'll just annihilate any boss it touch at the time. However, it's since gotten nerfed. Now it's still really good, it's just not as broken. But it's also a really interesting way of playing because, quite frankly, the visuals of just using spells is really interesting. However, with the retrospect in mind that I've played a lot of the other Souls games this time around, I play melee-focused things. Because melee is just more fun. It's more fun to be in the face of a boss, to dodge around them, to avoid their attacks, to hit every fiber of their body, to stab them, and to brutally slap down your sword into the ground and shoot a giant flaming lava pit up and heal yourself and kill them. I am looking at you, Blasphemous Blade. And it's much of the same criticism for the DLC. However, in the DLC's open world, there is this really interesting thing that they do called scheduled tree fragments. This is a way to mitigate the level scaling people have gotten to. So essentially, these scheduled tree fragments make the game easier depending on the amount you have collected. You do much more damage, you have much more damage negation by collecting them, and if you don't, you have much less. It is one of the reasons why early impressions of the DLC was that it was extremely difficult because people just didn't have the scheduled tree fragments, and that made it really, really hard. Whereas if you have the scheduled tree fragments, it is not that bad. Especially once you have a full amount of scheduled tree fragments in the DLC. Quite frankly, you do so much damage that it's kind of ridiculous. And I'm not sure if I personally like the system. I think we tried it in Dark Souls 2 with the giant souls. I didn't like it there. I can safely say I'm not a big fan of it here either, because to me it feels like one of those things where when I load into the DLC, the first thing I do is just have a quick gather around and collect all the scheduled tree fragments that are just scattered about the world. It's kind of a boring thing for repeat playthroughs, but as a first time experience, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. It also has to be said, I am very much in love with the world of the DLC. The open world that the DLC has is basically what Elden Ring does so well, condensed, slightly down, and then still being extremely big in comparison to fully sized games. I've spent more time in the Shadowlands than I have in most AAA games released nowadays. And that's saying something. I think that's pretty impressive. The DLC is just fantastic, and we'll get into why more in a bit. But goddamn, holy shit, this DLC slaps. Another aspect of the open world is that it takes the usually really steep learning curve and makes it a lot smoother, to the point where you learn the bosses more and more, and then you can just go into the flow state that these games put you in, while you sort of dodge around and everything. Because you see, there are a lot of easy bosses in Elden Ring, but then you have some of the hardest fights in any of the games here as well. Bosses like Melania, and especially the final boss of the DLC, completely thrashed me. There are others, but holy damn. And the thing is, hard bosses might be a thing in all of these games, and they do a lot of things. And there is also a rewarding moment, because when you go through a template like this... Holy... What a guy. What a man. I'm gonna die here. Oh. Not for long though. Thomas. You will also end up with a feeling like this when you finally finish the fight. Yes! And that feeling is something that Fromsoft does really well, and it's something that I'm happy more people get to experience, because these games are worth experiencing. Now, when it comes to the combat itself, it is the usual Fromsoft thing. You have your dodge rolling, you have your heavy attacks, you have your arts, your spells from your weapons, you have your sorceries, you have all of these things. and they're all great and they all play really well here again. And like usual, all of the weapons feels really good to use to me. I really like all of them. I like the power stance if you can do with two swords of the same type. I like how Elden Ring plays a lot. I think it feels really, really good to play. There are weapon arts that are just completely busted. For instance, I mentioned the Blasphemous Blade, which in my opinion at the moment is just the most busted thing in the game, because it takes almost nothing to get. It is very, very strong and takes almost no build or anything like that to really get going. Blasphemous Blade, essentially, if you don't know, it has an attack where you slam the sword into the ground after charging it for a bit, and that releases this giant magma wave that destroys the ground, and it then does a lot of damage to the boss you're fighting, and it also heals you for some of that damage. It is insane, and it's one of those weapons where I kind of think it's too busted personally, but that's also from having a thing like this happen. And Elden Ring has a lot of weapons, right? Like, there is a lot of choices for what you like and how you want to play, and with Shadow of the Erdtree, they added multiple, not just new weapons, but new types, among which is one of my favorite weapon types of all time at this point. And that is the Great Katana. The Great Katana just feels so good to power stance. The fact of the matter is, when you use a single one of them, the move can be a little bit wonky when enemy jumps and whatnot. You might not exactly hit your target all of the time, but then you power stance them. And all of a sudden you have one of the stupidest things I have ever seen in any game right here in Elden Ring. And it feels extremely good to play because they slap, they do a lot of damage, and not only do they do a lot of damage, but they also do the better part of just looking damn fucking cool. And one of the coolest things when it comes to Elden Ring is also just the weapon variety. There are so many choices in Elden Ring. Just in the base game alone, there are a lot of different choices and avenues for you to explore different builds with and different things to play. And I have had, when I see my friends start, they sometimes ask for help. Some of them go to YouTube and watch some live videos and whatnot. And then you see them transfer from doing that to building their own thing and making the weapon that they just found that they really like work for what they are doing. And I think it's just such a really cool thing to see. So many unique ways to play a single game. It's insane. And don't get it twisted. I think a lot of these weapons provide a very unique way to play the game, because your weapon sort of becomes an extension almost of the game. It becomes an extension of the character that you are playing, right? You see all of these things happening and you're like, yep, that's my weapon. I know that weapon. That weapon helped me get through X, Y, and Z bosses, so it'll help me get through the rest of the game. And I refuse to swap it out because it's my build. I made this. This is how I want to play. This is how I like playing. And it's really cool to see that happen. And it's also just a really cool thing that can happen because of the amount of variety that there is in Elden Ring. And variety wouldn't mean a whole lot if it wasn't for the option to change your build and your talisman and everything basically freely at your whim. In some of these games you don't have the option to respec. In Elden Ring you do. You can just go to Renala after you beat her, turn in a level tier, and you can respec your entire set of points into whatever you want them to be. And it's one of those things that I think is honestly a really nice feature that I would like the other games to have as well, and any games going forward, because it allows you to just experiment with other weapons. Midway through you can switch to a completely different weapon, and it's such a good feeling to not be punished at all for that. Because while I do like being punished, and I do like there being some sort of thing where you sit down and you're like, you have to learn this and you have to like live with your choices, I think when it comes to games like especially Fromsoft, there are so many weapons that I want to try that it sort of sucks to be locked out from trying them because I decided to put my points into something that didn't exactly match whatever weapon that I wanted to try that I didn't know about before I played. And the thing is, all of that is supported by what is probably some of the best boss fights in any game, period. Some of the boss fights in Elden Ring are just absolutely stunning. And I mean, literally from the very beginning, you defeat Sword of Gothic, you get out, and from there, it is just an upward trajectory of bosses. A lot of the bosses are really, really cool. I really like basically all of the Remembrance bosses, at least for first-time experience. They are insanely cool. Albeit, there are some of the Remembrance bosses that on repeat playthroughs can feel a little bit redundant. are just kind of boring. And same thing especially goes for the catacombs. Because you see, in Elden Ring, unlike Dark Souls 2 and 3, when you go into New Game Plus, there isn't anything that changes in the world. There aren't any new items for you to find, pick up, and the catacombs and dungeon items stay the same. And the catacombs already would start to feel repetitive by the end of the game, because they are literally just a different layout, but it's the same tile set, it's the same look to everything, and they have a different gimmick. But towards the tail end of the game, they're just kind of boring. You've had enough, and at least for me, it was one of those things where, especially after I knew what was in them, I was just, God damn it, I have to go through this bullshit. Fuck this. I just want to have it done, because they are fairly repetitive, they're very boring, and that is one thing that I can say that the DLC at least to me fixed a lot of, because they made the catacombs straight up more interesting by having more unique and interesting mechanics in them, rather than, oh yeah, now you have to go through all of the trap chests, good luck. It is one of those things where in the main game, especially the catacombs, the side dungeons are just really kind of boring. And that is not to shed on them at all, because again, for the first experience, there's always that tinkle of, what is inside this dungeon? What if there's some loot here I can use? What if there's something for my build here I can use? On the second playthrough though, it is more a case of not playing them at all because you've just had enough. Because the thing is, there is a lot, and I mean a lot of similar boss fights in those. A lot of the bosses are just the same boss with a slightly different name, or maybe they added 2 of them. It is sort of a shame, because I think the catacombs definitely did have some potential and whatnot, and I think they were found, like the potential for those were found in the DLC, but I think in the main game, they just don't really hit the spot that they need to, unfortunately. And I think that can also be said for most of the side dungeons in the main game in comparison to the DLC. I think the DLC fixes a lot of the problems that I have by making it all more interesting and more unique, and especially the boss fights just being cooler overall definitely helps a lot for my want to replay them in the DLC, these side dungeons and catacombs and whatnot. And I have to also say that I think the amount of times I start seeing imps, especially again in the main game, like you see imps from the very beginning, from the very first catacombs all the way up to the very last one. It's like, why? I have seen a trillion of these guys now. I've had enough of them. No more imps. Hashtag remove the imps. And then they brought them back from the expansion, and they changed the moveset. They made them a little bit different. And then they did the one thing that I hope they never do. They added Impzilla, a giant ass imp that is the embodiment of everything I fear and am scared of. I still have nightmares about that imp. And most of the copy-paste thing can also be said about a lot of the overworld bosses. There is a lot of the draconic Tree Sentinel, Tree Guardian, and it is essentially the same boss with slightly different buffs and debuffs, if at all different. Some of them are just the same, and it's one of those things where I think, again, on the first playthrough, it's completely fine, it is inoffensive, nobody cares. But once you start to replay them, you end up just running past them because who cares? Like, I don't want to fight Draconic Spirit Man for the 15th time. You can jump and spread Scarlet Rot on himself, not on me. I'm not doing that again. And it's not even because those fights are in particularly hard, it's just that they're kind of pointless because you've already seen it, and their movesets are usually quite simple. But if you have to fight 16 of them in a single playthrough, it's just kind of enough. At that point, it is not a boss anymore, it takes the unique factor of them out, and it's a bit of a shame to see that happen. But overall, it's not the biggest of deals, because again, on the first playthrough, it is magical to go through. I can also safely say the Dragon fights haven't improved at all, with the exception of the main games, Lanciac and Placidusax. A lot of the lightning dragons aren't the worst. They tend to stay more off the ground and be less sort of flying around, more in an area where you can actually fight them. However, Placidusax, outside of being one of my favorite bosses, just because of the way he looks. I mean, bro is fitting the ball outfit. He is out here looking like a ball, a circle, and I absolutely love it. I'm all here for that. However, after your first fight with him, he might be a little annoying, as he tends to stay outside of the arena like the usual dragon fight, and the uniqueness of his battle can't really just fix that. And then he has his I am now a lightning sky attack, and it is kind of annoying. It is one of those things where he's just not in the arena with you, and why? It irritates me a lot. I want to fight him. I'm here to fight him, not here to watch him do his fucking aerobatics. If I wanted to see him do aerobatics, I'd do that. But I want to fight him. I want to have a fair and square fight here, fist fight, right? And bro is just out here, out in the sky, just plain sky. And it's kind of annoying, and the DLC also has a fight I really like when it comes to dragons, and that is Bale. Bale the Dread. Bale the Dread is my favorite boss fight, I think, from the entire DLC. I love Bale. Bale is fantastic. Not just because he's a really good boss fight. Bale is a really good boss fight when you're just playing by yourself. But you can have the summon in the Bale fight and have a Drake Hunter called Eagle. And he has the single best monologue of all time that I will link a meme to down in the first pinned comment, just because I think you have to see the meme. I cannot do justice here. You have to see it, the meme version of it, and it's fantastic. I love this fight. I love Bale. I think Bale is fantastic. They're both sporting the ball design where they seem more like an angry chihuahua that's slightly oversized rather than a dragon, and I'm all here for it. I think the design is perfect. I'm all here for it. More dragons do ball. Outside of that, there are of course a lot of really good fights. Horror Lou or Garpy is my personal favorite from the main game, and I think I have to say Mesmer is just my favorite from the DLC. There are so many good fights throughout Elden Ring. It is hard to count the amount of just A+ boss fights, just the S tier boss fights. And of course, when you have that many S tier boss fights, there also has to be some D tier boss fights. And unfortunately, for every Millennia we have, we also have Nastel. And it is one of those things where I don't think any of these bosses are bad on your first playthrough. I think it's when you start to replay the game that they become sort of annoying and bad and just unfun to play against. And I think that can be said for a few bosses. Again, I mentioned Stel, who I don't like. I don't like the Dragon Skin Warrior, because I think eventually you'll just get a little bit too good at him. He's just a little bit undertuned once you have played against him a couple of times. And I think, again, there are a couple of bosses like that, but overall, it's a good basket, and that includes the side dungeons. A lot of the dungeons and whatnot also have really fun bosses to fight. One of my favorite things that Elden Ring does is they have this thing called Evergales, which is not exactly a dungeon, but it's a side boss where it's just you against some NPC boss, and it is almost always good. I really do like those fights a lot. I think they add a lot to the game because they trim the fat of having to do some boring ass dungeon that I don't want to do, and just takes me to the part that I actually enjoyed, that being the really interesting and fun fight. And I think while there are some repeating going on there, you have your Bloodhound Fang guy man that is being used at both another dungeon but also just randomly on a wall in Rare Lucaria. I think there are some repeating going on there that might be a little bit boring, but overall I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think there's fun. Even on my repeat playthroughs on my New Game Pluses, I did enjoy playing the Evergales. And when it comes to all of these things, they're all packed into a beautiful world where the designs are just out of this world for everything, both in the sense that bosses like, well, Estelle are grotesque, they're evil, but then you have something like Radahn and Khaled, which is just such a tragically beautiful fight. Everywhere from the cutscenes in it, from his transition, from the fact that you have summons and summon all the companions along to fight him. It is just such a beautiful fight. It's so cinematic and it's so fantastic to play through, and it's genuinely one of those bosses where I hold a lot of love for it. You can also see that, you know, he was probably a really good warrior just through the way he fights back in his heyday, you know, which you'll find out in the DLC he definitely was out. But that being said, that design philosophy of having these things where you can clearly see that there is history in the land, things that dig deeper than just the surface, is throughout all of their designs, like usual with Fromsoft. There is meaning in the designs. There are honestly things that just fit so well together, and it's all of these cohesive pieces coming together. How all of Rare Lucaria are this magic obsessed nerd. How Renala has this weird hat that fits entirely in with this weird wizard academy Hogwarts wanna be like ass motherfucker, right? And it's all of these things that fit so well together that forms a really cohesive picture of Elden Ring, and how well everything does that. We haven't talked about one of the areas that I think I'm gonna catch a little bit of shit for saying, but it's my favorite. The Erdtree is one of those things where it's just so aesthetically beautiful. Holy fuck, the Erdtree is pretty. It's in everything, especially once you get down from the initial branch and you start moving through these open areas and these beautiful landscapes. I love it. I really do. I really love it. And then you go into the sewers, and even in the sewer system in the Erdtree, somehow it's beautiful. And then you go back out and you find Melania, which has also ended up on my top 10 list of boss fights for all time. I just really like everything about Melania as well. After being her the first time was a pain in the ass, but once you start to get to know the boss, it's not that bad, and it's also just a really, really interesting boss fight, and the music is there and everything just hits right. I really like the aesthetic things about Elden Ring, and like always, I love the idea of just being able to get the boss's weapon. I love the fact that I can see Melania, well, kill her and then get her sword. That's just fucking dope, and have like the waterfall move. Even if the waterfall move, when you get it from Melania, is kinda ass, it's still just really fun to be able to do. To be able to have these weapons from the bosses, it's just really cool. I really like that system. I think it's one of those things that I will always appreciate Fromsoft does, and it's one of those things that I hope they keep on doing, because it is really special and kind of fucking awesome to be able to play with something that the boss you just killed, the thing that I've been killing you over and over, you can all of a sudden hold it. And while yes, often it is to a lesser extent, in the sense that some of the attacks might not exactly be as strong as the bosses, or at least feel that way, it is still just one of those things where it's just really cool. It's just a cool factor. It is dope. And all of this is built on top of fantastic lore and story. Because the thing is, like with a lot of the games, Fromsoft doesn't just design something, they sort of tell a story through the design. And that design is written by none other than George R.R. Martin. And here's where I'll tell a snippet of that story, but I don't think I can do it justice. However, I am gonna recommend that you just head over to Vadividia's page and just check him out. I'll again link him in the description because he's awesome. And it's where I get basically all of my lore. And he has all of this lore stuff, right? And Fromsoft does lore in a really unique and fantastic way where, again, very much like the old Souls games, it's bittersweet, a lot of it. It is these beautiful and fantastic stories that are told through the game that you sort of, to some degree, get to add meaning to through your struggles within the game. And it's one of those things that I think Elden Ring does so well. Just like most of the other Fromsoft library, they also do this well, where you tell a story through your struggle. It is your story being told. And I think that's just a really cool thing to see in a game that is really rare to see. Even now, I don't think a lot of developers get the step right where it's the player story being told through their actions, not just through a dialogue box, but through how you play, why you struggle, which bosses you can beat, and so on. It is such an interesting thing, and Fromsoft is so good at doing it, it's wild. And another thing that's wild is just the other not intended experiences you can have with Elden Ring. I have completed a randomized run with a friend of mine, and it's been some of the best fun I've had in a while. Just these random bosses everywhere, and the fun of it is obviously also playing with my friend in a co-op Elden Ring run. Which, yes, is a lot easier because, I mean, it's co-op. You have a partner and you sort of trade, aggro and everything. And that makes it easier, but it's also one of those things where it's just kind of fun to do. And in a randomized run especially, it's really fun because you don't really know what's behind the doors, and it keeps the game slightly fresh again. And another thing that has to be said when it comes to Elden Ring is that the mod scene is fucking crazy. There are the big ones like Convergence and whatnot, but the amount of mods I have seen that changes the way you play Elden Ring or changes something about Elden Ring is fucking insane. There's complete overhaul mods out there. Garden of Ice, the YouTube channel and Patreon page, has some of the most insane mods I have ever seen for any game. The creativity of this community is fucking insane. And that reflects itself both in the mods, but also just some of the wild challenges people have taken on and the challenge runs. There are people who beat the game with every weapon in the game. There are people who beat the entire game without poison. There are so many insane challenges that it's just infinitely more fun to watch. And while I do want to do some challenges myself, I don't think I'm gonna be doing the all poison run. I will say though, I think it's extremely cool to see the creativity of the Elden Ring community and the Fromsoft community in the way that it is displayed with a game like Elden Ring. Because it's really there, from the story videos that you see that are super cinematics, to the mods, to the challenge runs. This community is insane, and it's insanely creative, and it's fucking awesome to see. One thing I do think I have to cover as well is that now that DLC has been out, I've seen some complaints that it might be a little bit too hard in some areas, and I think you aren't exactly wrong. It is extremely hard. Fromsoft has always done this though. The DLC has usually been where they put the hardest bosses, because it is the point in the game where you should you've gone through everything else, you should be ready to face the newer challenge, right? And I think the issue that a lot of people encountered is that they might have played through the game once, they killed Melania, maybe they got a little bit of help, maybe they caught Melania, and now the DLC is out, they didn't pick up any Skadoo tree fragments, so they go in and they get fucking smacked. And I think that's the issue with the Skadoo tree system, because especially if you're playing on day one, you might not exactly know about that. You probably wouldn't realize what it was doing. So you would either screw it very much in your favor by just collecting them and banking them in there, and you wanted the challenge of playing, the hardest possible way. Or maybe you didn't know about it and you went through it like you would with any other Elden Ring expansion or Elden Ring area, and you were wondering, why am I dealing shit for damage all of a sudden? Is the game broken? What is happening? And I think that's ultimately a fault with the Skadoo tree fragments. I am not a big fan of them at all, like you can see here. And it doesn't help that, again, the final boss, Radahn, is insane to play against. It is literally a Melania 2.0. I find him to be infinitely harder than Melania, mainly due to his second phase, where when he swings, there's all the lasers coming out and the holy beams just hitting you from the sky. I'm not a big fan of that at all. I think it's one of those things where it slightly, maybe it's over in the overtune category. I'm not quite sure. I myself found after beating him that he is a fairly good boss. I really do enjoy him. I can definitely see though why on your first playthrough he is a major hurdle, and he's one of those things where you feel like you have gone through a lot of already hard bosses. Like for me, I literally beat Mesmer, and the next big boss fight was him, and Mesmer was a struggle for me as well. And I get like, you beat them and you get into these really fucking hard boss that is gonna kick your ass. And I think it's one of those things where it isn't necessarily just a skill issue, it's also just the fact that he can feel kind of wonky in some of his attacks. Specifically the one where he jumps up into the air and he hits like 5 times in a row just down at you. Because in my initial playthrough, I thought I could hit him meanwhile. And sometimes my attacks just wouldn't register. Either it was me not hitting, or it's the fact that you outright can't hit him because he's just projecting himself down there. And I find that to be often kind of annoying. And he has some attacks that I do find just to be too much, like his phase transition. It's not hard to dodge, you just have to run directly away from it. But it's at the same time, it also lags out my PC, on top of obviously just being a huge AoE, where it feels mildly annoying. I do understand why people find him to be too tough though. I do think it's a very valid point. However, I do also think you should, if you haven't maxed out your Skadoo, or you have maxed out your Skadoo tree fragments, then no shame in doing what you have to beat him. But if you haven't maxed out that Skadoo, and then just go in there and get him through, because the feeling afterwards is definitely worth it. And that's sort of my end of my opinion on the DLC difficulty thing. I think once you've picked up all of the Skadoo tree fragments, it is manageable. I think before that, it is kind of overtuned, and I think the fact that the Skadoo tree system exists is kind of not my favorite thing in the world. I understand why it exists, exist, but I don't think it should exist still. And again, that is because I think there should just be a scaling once you go in there that scale toward, I'd say, a level 150-ish would be where most people are when they kill Moog with a lot of blood for the first time, and I think that'd be an okay area to sort of balance the game for. And then if you were too over leveled, that's one thing. If you're too under leveled, that's another thing. But then you sort of at least have the option, if you were, you know, to have a balanced experience instead of this sort of collector fun experience that's just kind of unfun, especially while you're collecting all of them. That being said, that is it for me. That is it for the review. I love Elden Ring. I really love all of these games. I think they're all fantastic. Even Dark Souls 2, I think Dark Souls 2 is worth playing. And with all of that being said, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all later. If you like the video, like, comment, and subscribe to all of the YouTube stuff. You know what you're doing. And that's it for me. I am out. See you all later.